Okay, welcome back. This is the fourth part of the videos reviewing the first test and going over the different parts. In this part, we're going to go over the slide comparison questions and the essay question. And then in the fifth and final part, we'll go over the extra credit. So for the first comparison question was to compare these two works in terms of line. And let's actually read the question. I have it right here in front of me. Okay, compare these two works in terms of how they use, wait, that's the wrong one. Let me turn to the comparison question. Compare these two artworks in terms of the use of line, right? Include comparison of the overall line weight, the variety of line weight, possibly discuss calligraphic line, how gestural the lines are, how line and tone work together, how the lines create areas of focus, how the lines create value, discuss both line weight and hatching and cross-hatching, what kind of tool makes the lines, and how much is the line focused on contour or cross-contour or neither. Extra credit for identifying either image. So obviously, everyone should have been able to identify the first drawing by Ang because that was one we were studying for the test anyway. And people should have expected the Lebrun to be the contrast to the Ang. So but I think some people maybe got Seated Man, or I think maybe one or two people remembered it was by someone named Lebrun. Anyway, so in terms of the contrast, the very first thing is that overall line weight is much heavier on the Lebrun, much lighter on the Ang, but they both have a lot of contrast between line weight, right? Some lines that are much darker and some are lighter. Now, one of the things that you probably should have noted is that these lines are made with brush and ink, and so the lines, the variation in line weight is only a variation in the thickness or thinness of the line, whereas in the Ang, right, there is variation of line weight, but it's primarily not a change in the thinness or thickness of the line. It's primarily a change in the value of the line. The line, when you press a pencil down harder, the line gets literally darker. Whereas when you press a brush down on a page, the black ink doesn't get any blacker. It just gets wider. Okay, so that was one thing. So they both have change of line weight, but the range is wider, right, on the Lebrun, but also on the Lebrun, the change in line weight is entirely a change of thickness of line, whereas in the Ang, it's a change of thickness, but mostly it's a change of value of the line. Okay, so the Lebrun, the lines are more calligraphic, the lines are looser, more gestural, the line work is, there's more use of cross contour, but there is some thought about cross contour lines on the Ang drawing as well. There's no tone whatsoever on the Lebrun, right? It's just line on paper, whereas on the Ang drawing, it is supported by tone. There are tone in places, especially around the head. And then that leads to another important contrast, which is how do the two drawings create hierarchy and emphasis? How do they create areas of focus? And in the Ang drawing, it's primarily through increase of value, especially through line weight, but also through hatching, cross-hatching, and tone. And so that increase in value contrast in the areas around, let's say, the violin or the areas around the face, right, especially the face, really draw our attention, whereas other places are much lighter because it's really just developed with line work, and the line work is mostly light. In the Lebrun, we see a similar kind of thing, which is there's a lot of attention to the body and to these crossed arms, and that's created by the heavy line weight in those arms and the gesturalness and the activity of those lines. But we also see that as a secondary emphasis, the face draws our attention for the exact opposite reason, which is it is the only place in the drawing where the lines get really, really thin and very delicate. So that covers, I think, just about everything that was on that question, and most people did pretty well on that. One thing, as I was doing more research on this and getting the date info for the Lebrun, I realized that this drawing is not the only nor the most famous version of this drawing. That Lebrun had another one like this. I can't actually find, to be certain, the original brush drawing that, but as you can tell, this almost looks like it would have just been a simplification, but if you really look carefully, the drawings are slightly different in certain things, like, you know, the certain details, like this mark is not the same. This is much more of a perfect curve right there. And so I actually like this version better, but it makes the contrast a little bit harder because now we have tone in there and it more complicates the issue. Okay, so the slide comparison number 2 was to compare these two works in terms of how they use form and space. And so first of all, everyone should have been able to identify the palette and armor, but I also put the identification information on the Henry Moore. Once again, I think there were some major clues that the Henry Moore would be the one that would be a contrast to the palette and armor. The question reads, compare these two works in terms of how they use form and space, include a discussion of relief, freestanding and in the round. Also discuss positive and negative volumes, as well as how surface and texture affect how a work engages space. So the simplest discussion right now is that this is a relief sculpture, so very shallow in space, and it's a low relief, so pretty much about as low as a relief sculpture can get. You really can't get much more low relief than that. Whereas the Henry Moore is not only freestanding, but fully in the round, and it's very engaging of the space, right? Especially, and that issue having to do with negative space and negative volume, right? It creates these large openings of negative volume, right? And that are very inviting. In fact, you see kids climb in and through and on Henry Moores all the time. Some people got confused on the negative volume issue, thinking it was talking about negative shape, right? Yes, there are definitely areas of interesting negative shapes in the palette of Namur, like in here, or like this very smart use of negative shape as a area to create for mixing of paint. But that is not an example of negative volume, right? Negative shape is not the same thing as negative volume. This is an example of negative volume, which is actual empty space, air, right? That is occupied by no form. Okay. And then lastly, I think, I mean, there is kind of an interesting texture to the palette of Namur because of the type of stone. But I don't think it particularly affects how we react to it in terms of space. Whereas the form, the texture, the polish, like this really kind of interesting combination of both a rough feel and a highly polished feel to these two forms, making them feel very kind of natural and stone-like, but almost body-like, I think really makes them that much more inviting and makes that much more the engagement of space and the engagement of you into these negative volumes makes it that much more exciting. So I think that is a major part of it. Okay, and so lastly, let's talk about the short paragraph essay question, which was on the history of red figure to black figure. And so first I want to say on this question, you were supposed to cite at least 3 examples, and not everybody did that. So that was one of the things where people had points taken off. When you think about what examples you could cite, well, this piece, Achilles and Ajax Amphora, was on the study guide and was on the test. So you should have been able to cite this as at least as an example of black figure. This piece was on the study guide and was an extra credit question on the test. And so you should have been able to cite this as an example of a contemporary or a modern work of art that uses figure-ground relationships as a major part of its aesthetic. But there was nothing in terms of red figures, so you would have had to do some research on your own, but there's no reason why you couldn't have looked up which pieces of red figure pottery I talked about the most in all the lectures, and that probably would have been this particular amphora. And so you could have made sure to note that, to study that so that you would be able to reference it. And you could, it's just titled amphora here, or if you want to be more specific, you could call it the Hercules amphora, because this particular scene we're looking at is Hercules stealing a tripod from a temple. And then also you could have just referred to the FedEx logo as another example of something that uses negative, negative shapes and a play with figure ground. So what should you have said? Well, primarily you should have, A, gotten these major points. One, red figure came first, right? Or sorry, black figure came first. Let's go back to black figure. Black figure came first, comes out of the Orientalizing period. And in black figure, the positive things, like the figures, but all the things, not just people, all the positive things are painted black. And then the red of the clay is used as the blank, right? Like a page, like the blank space. Drawing is then done with a sharpened stylus, scratching back into the black slip to make lines. Whereas in red figure, the figures are drawn out carefully in a thin brush, right? And this allows for the drawing to be more delicate and more flowing. And then the negative space is painted black and the figures are left red. And like I emphasized in class, this is a really important shift, because here's a situation where we see a culture kind of making this idea of flipping between the positive, like instead of painting the positive thing with a positive mark, realizing I can paint the positive thing by leaving it blank or mostly blank and painting the negative space black, right? Thereby creating the positive thing by painting the space around it, right? And that's a critical flip in the way people think about positive and negative. And it allows the Greek artists to be much more thoughtful about how they're creating negative space shapes. And I'm not saying that in black figure pottery there were no interesting negative space shapes. There were. They were very thoughtful about negative space shapes in black figure as well, but they were even more so. And I think it's just an interesting kind of shift, because we can really see a people in this one particular moment kind of making that shift from very positive, kind of positive mark, positive shape, positive thing type thinking to make a positive mark in the negative shape, and right, and then paint the negative shape, the negative space, right, as a mark in order to create the positive thing. And then I think that this is very relevant to the importance of positive and negative space thinking and figure ground in contemporary art, in contemporary design. Okay, so those were some of the things that you should have got in the essay question. Okay, I think that is the end. The last part will be on the extra credit questions and the extra credit identification. Okay, see you there.